Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show you a technique for incorporating a found object into your slow stitching. Although it's not really a found object. It's a painted object onto fabric. Now we're going to paint it with acrylic paints, but we're going to make it so that you can't stitch through it. You technically could if you really tried, but that's not the point of this project. The idea here is that we're just going to use some fabric paints to paint a shamrock or a four-leaf clover onto some fabric and then use that in our slow stitching. And the reason is because sometimes it's hard to find particular objects to use in your slow stitching that are both flat and easy to use, as well as a particular theme. In this case, I have a hard time finding St. Patrick's Day themed items. So the shamrock or the four-leaf clover is a perfect item to stitch onto your fabric. In previous videos, I've showed how you can cut them out of felt or use buttons or different techniques, but this is a totally different effect and it's quite beautiful. It's also pretty simple. I use just 3 colors of craft paint. So let's get started. So here's an example of using just a simple acrylic painted shamrock, which you can do a four-leaf clover as well, in your slow stitching. I made it the focal point here, and then I emphasized that shamrock, that subject, with just some green. I painted the word Irish, and just to tie it in, I used the same colors from my shamrock, just dabbing it onto my already stitched piece here. And this way it kind of coordinates nicely. It's just a nice image. Now let me show you how simple it is to do this. And I'm just using craft paints here. You can use great quality acrylics as well, but this is really a project to use whatever you have. I've shown previous videos with watercolor, which gives a totally different effect. Here I'm just using acrylic paints. For this shamrock, it's very simple. I like 3 colors. I have a green, a light green, and then just a light yellow. Any variation of those colors will work beautifully. Before we get started painting though, we have to set up our fabric. Now, acrylic paint is kind of like a plastic, so it's not something you can really stitch through unless you modify it. We're not going to modify it today. We're going to make it an element. So to that end, I plan out my piece and I just take that piece of fabric and I know I'm going to stitch my shamrock on here. So I'll stitch the remaining pieces down, leaving just a gap for the piece I want to add to it. So I'm going to show you how to make that piece, that painted fabric. Now to make the painted fabric, I'm just using muslin. You can use any type of fabric you want. Particularly cotton fabric is the best, but if you want to experiment and try it with a polyester or a nylon, go right ahead. Because it's acrylic paint, it will work. I also use a piece of freezer paper here, just because it gives a little body to my piece while I'm painting. Now the fabric and the paint will go through the fabric, so it's a good idea to have something on the back. If you don't want to use freezer paper, because you don't have it, you can use any type of paper. I would suggest scrap paper, and just make sure your surface is covered. If you're going to go the route that I'm suggesting today, I take the freezer paper, which has a shiny side, a waxy side, and a dull side. You want that shiny side to connect with your fabric. So I take a hot iron, I press my fabric just to get the wrinkles out, and then I'm just going to iron over the fabric. I don't want to iron on the paper because that wax will melt onto my iron. So the best way to do that is to flip it and iron on the dull side of your paper. I just take a moment to really press it. It's a temporary hold, and it just gives me that layer, that background to my fabric. It holds my fabric taut, it holds it nice and straight, and it gives me a little buffer so that when I paint, I'm not destroying my work surface. Now, if you're not using the freezer paper, you can just tape your fabric to any background paper just to protect your surface. You can also tape it right to your surface if you have a silicone mat or something to that effect. So now that I'm ready to paint, I just want to make sure my paper cools down and my fabric cools down, and now I'll get my supplies. Now, because I'm making a shamrock, you can make a four-leaf clover just as easily, I'm just going to do a light sketch with a pencil. What I do is I just decide how large I want my piece, and then I just make 3 hearts. So I'll just make the first heart, just a light little sketch, and then I want 2 other hearts. And again, I'm just doing a light sketch, and I can modify this as I go along. And then I'll add a third little heart here. Now the purpose of this is to create that shamrock shape. And I can go around and modify it, making the hearts all approximately the same size. If I press too hard, my fabric will buckle, but it's not really a big deal. It is only a temporary measure. I have my three colors, my dark green, light green, and a yellow, just because those are the colors I want to use. And then I have two paintbrushes, a very thin liner brush, 5/0. This one's called a detailer. And then I just have a 4. It's a rounded brush. Use whatever brushes you have and you're comfortable with. I like to start by making that little stem of the shamrock. So I take my green, and I just grab a little bit of the light green too, because I like that variation. And I just barely touch the paper. I'll go and dip it in the green again, start at the top, and just pull it down until I have that shape. And I'll go over it a couple of times. I could come back in with that lighter color, just to give it a little painterly look, because it is supposed to look handmade and authentic. Rinse out my brush, because the acrylic paint does dry, and it'll dry hard and ruin your brush. So I don't like to let it sit in the water, and I don't like to let the paint dry on the brush. Take a moment just to make sure it's clean again. And now I'll switch to my larger brush. Because I want a little variation in the paint, I'm going to start with this dark green color. And I'll roll it around in my brush. And now I'm just going to outline the bottom of my hearts here. You can see if you don't have enough paint, it kind of gives brush strokes. And that's kind of an interesting look in itself. And then I'll come back in, and I'm just working on the bottom, the pointy part of these hearts. Kind of clean my brush by filling it in. Once I have all 3 of those done, just like that, I'll come back in with a little more and just connect them. So that's starting out really nicely. I'm going to come in here with my lighter green. And now just starting on one heart, I'm going to just paint the outline. Come back in, overlap right over that darker green. And then I'll just brush through that darker green. Don't want to have globs of paint, but I want enough paint to cover my fabric and really fill in all that weaving. So now I have my little heart. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I just want to remove some of that little dip of the heart. Don't want it to be a perfect heart. I'll come back in with a little more of that darker green and pull it out from the base, just to give a little bit of a variation there. And then just with my brush, I'll rub off some of that light green, dab a little of that yellow, and just add a little bit of highlights. Just like that. Twist my piece, and I'll do the same technique on all the sides of my shamrock. And if I was using a 4-leaf clover, I would do the same thing on the 4-leaf clover. I like to go in first with the darker green just to re-wet it, and then I just mix up some of the medium green with the darker green. And I can just finish my leaves the same way. It's a little fun technique. It looks very personal, very unique. And it's perfect for when you can't find the exact focal point for your piece, or if you just want to make a focal point. Sometimes you want to paint, you want to include it in your sewing. It's like a found object, not quite found, however, more like created. And there I have a beautiful shamrock. Now I have to be patient and let this dry. So here are some additional shamrocks that I've painted. And as you can see on the back, the paint comes right through. These are dry, and I'll just save these in my stash to use as I want. But I wanted to show you exactly what it's like once it finally dries. So I still have my freezer paper attached. All you do is just peel it off. And you can see it's very easy to peel off. You can also see that some of the paint transfers, which is why we want to use it. Now from here, I'll just treat this as a piece of fabric that I want to cut and use in my work. So I made this little strip of multiple teeny shamrocks. So I'll just cut this down gently and add this to my supplies, which I can use in my work. And then I have these shamrocks. So I'll just cut these apart. Again, I can trim them however I'd like. And use these in my work as well. So now when I'm ready to stitch, I'll just take one of those shamrocks that I've painted. Again, it's completely dry, and here's the back. And if you feel it, the paint has made it a little bit stiff. And now I'm ready to use it in my work. I have this little piece that I've already stitched. I can either put it on this side or on the back here. I took a little piece of fabric just to really enhance it, and I can trim that down to size. Putting it on my little fabric tag that I've made, figuring out exactly how I want it, and then adding that shamrock. From there, I'll take my thread and stitch around, just like I did here. I can even stitch around the shamrock as I did on this one. So that's just a fun and interesting way to make a focal point for your work, particularly if you can't find a particular subject that you want. It uses inexpensive craft paints, and you can make it to size and color, the specifics of what you want for your piece. So that's how I paint onto my fabric and then use that in my slow stitching. It's kind of a neat technique, and I really enjoy it, particularly for the St. Patrick's Day theme. I have a hard time finding objects to use in my slow stitching. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.